I don't hear any applause. Much better, much better. Thank you, thank you, thank you. My name is Deroy Murdock. I'll be the moderator for our panel today, which is called Deficits Debunked. It's a spending problem, not a revenue problem. I am a Fox News contributor, a contributing editor with National Review Online, and also a senior fellow with the Atlas Network. We support approximately 475 free market think tanks in about 90 countries in the United States of America. As I was coming down here a couple days ago, I took a cab to Pennsylvania Station. I was getting out of the cab. Somebody's waiting to hop in, and as he was hopping in, I said, "Where'd you come from?" He said, "Oh, I came from Boston." I said, "Well, what was it like digging through the snow?" He said, "Oh, it was pretty rough." He said, "Where are you going?" I said, "Well, I'm going to Washington, D.C. I want to watch them incinerate our money." So we're going to have a panel today talking about the incineration of our money and hopefully doing a lot less of it. And we have a very distinguished panel here which will explore this issue with us. We'll have them speak. I'll ask them a few questions, and we'll throw the floor open to you and hear what's on your minds. Excuse me. So we're going to start today with Congressman Tom Price, MD. Representative Tom Price, a third-generation physician, first found his calling for service as an orthopedic surgeon treating patients in the metropolitan Atlanta area. In 1996, Georgia's 56th State Senate district suddenly was represented after great hard work and campaigning by Dr. Price. He became the minority whip in the Georgia State Senate, elected twice, and he helped to lead the Republican Party to a majority in the state Senate, ending 150 years of majority Democrat rule.
That was a good thing.
In 2004, Dr. Price was elected as the representative for Georgia's 6th Congressional District, and as a member of Congress, Representative Price has earned a reputation as a leader in healthcare policy and as an advocate for a more limited, effective, and efficient government. He currently is chairman of the House Budget Committee and also serves on the House Ways and Means Committee. Representative Price earned both his bachelor's degree and Doctor of Medicine from the University of Michigan. Please welcome the man who is trying to keep Washington from incinerating all of our money, Dr. Tom Price.
Thank you so much, Deroy. Good morning to you.
Morning.
You are the stalwarts. You're the ones who've been here throughout the whole thing, so thank you so much. Thanks for all that you all are doing to make certain that we continue to focus on conservative principles and conservative solutions to the incredible challenges that we have. So I am so honored to be with you. Deroy, thanks for that wonderful introduction. I'm pleased to join Deroy again on a panel. We're not talking about healthcare this time. We're going to talk about, well, it's actually connected, because healthcare is indeed connected to the health of our economy, and we'll touch on that as well. I'm also pleased to join Mark Green and Jonathan Bydlak on the panel, two folks who are really extremely accomplished and have a wonderful perspective. I think CPAC has done a great job to bring both a federal perspective, state perspective, and then an advocacy and probably the wisest perspective on the outside of government. So it's great to be here. Many of you know that Admiral Mike Mullen, who was the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff 3 or 4 years ago, was asked the question, as the highest ranking military officer in the country at the time, and he was asked, what's the greatest threat to the United States national security? And you think about what the highest ranking military officer in this country could say in response to that question. The greatest threat to the United States national security. And he said one word: debt. The debt of this nation. What he knows and what you know and what we may need to make certain the American people understand and appreciate is that unless you have economic security, you can't have national security. It's impossible. No nation has ever done it. So I've been asked to talk a little bit about the federal perspective, and I want to talk about, as it relates to deficits and debt and spending, and I want to talk about the size, the magnitude of the problem that we have, the source, what's caused this problem, and then I want to touch on a solution, because oftentimes we as conservatives, we end with the size and the source, and we stop and don't provide the solution, and then people don't think we're connecting the dots, and it's so important to do that so the American people recognize that there is a vision and a positive way forward. What's the size of the debt? You know, a certain level of debt is okay. Most of you have debt. You've got either a mortgage or an automobile loan or a student loan, or you've got a credit card, and if you keep that debt in check and in an appropriate level, then it's okay. But at some point, it can become all-consuming. Debt individually, debt for a business, debt for a municipality, or debt for a federal government can become all-consuming. And I would suggest to you that we are very, very close. $18 trillion, greater than $18 trillion in debt as a nation, greater than 100% of our gross domestic product, $60,000 for every man, woman, and child in this country. Huge, huge amount of debt. And the projection is that it's going to continue to rise and be over $25 trillion in a few short years. Now, debt, as you well know, changes behavior. Decreasing opportunity with increasing debt, decreasing growth with increasing debt, decreasing flexibility, increasing dependence. The higher your debt goes, the more dependent you are on the individual or the entity loaning you the money. Dare I say, with increasing debt, we are less free. Greater debt that this nation consumes harms not just our economy, but our very future. So that's the size, that's the magnitude of the problem. What's the source? Well, as a physician, I spent 20-plus years practicing orthopedic surgery. I knew that if you didn't make the right diagnosis, the patient got well by luck. So you got to make the right diagnosis. And that's what this panel is about. And the diagnosis isn't terribly difficult, as you well know. Deficit is a pretty simple equation. It's the amount of spending that you have over the minus the amount of revenue. If your spending is greater than your amount of money that you've got available to spend, then you have a deficit. If your spending is less than the amount of money you have available, then you have a surplus. Debt is the accumulated deficit year after year after year, and revenue is the amount of money that is coming in this instance coming into the federal government by way of taxes. Last year, 2014, your federal government collected $3.02 trillion in revenue, in taxes and fees. $3.02 trillion. The highest level of revenue ever to this federal government. Yet we continue to pile on increasing deficits and increasing debt. For the past 6 years, we've had deficits of greater than $1 trillion, $1 trillion annually, $7.5 trillion added to the federal debt in just the last 6 years alone. And the presidential budget that he put forward just a couple months ago would add another $8.5 trillion. Every dollar that's taxed and every dollar that's borrowed isn't just a number on a page. It's a dollar that can't be used to buy a home, to pay your rent, to buy a car, to pay education fees. All of the things that the American people want to do are harmed by an increasing federal debt. So we are in a spending-driven debt crisis. This isn't a revenue-driven debt crisis, and this isn't new, although the magnitude is new. As Ronald Reagan said, the problem in Washington is not that we tax too little, it's that we spend too much, and you all know that well. So what's the solution? There are three ways to decrease your debt. You can do what our friends on the other side of the aisle always want to do and only want to do, and that's to increase taxes, to increase revenue to the federal government. The fact of the matter is that you get to a point where you don't gain more revenue when you increase taxes. You can decrease spending, and we need to do that. We'll talk a little bit about the two different silos of spending that we have in the federal government, discretionary spending or automatic or mandatory spending. So you can decrease spending, and we need to make certain that we're doing that and getting that under control. But the real secret is to grow the economy, is to make certain that we grow the economy in a way that has happened every single time. And when you grow the economy, you increase revenue to the federal government, because a thriving economy, people working, people starting jobs, starting businesses out there increase the revenue coming into the federal government. So what are we proposing through the Budget Committee? A budget that will actually get to balance. The president's budget never balances. We have a budget that actually balances, that lays out the vision for the American people to see that there are folks in Washington fighting as hard as we can to bring about the right kind of programs. Not just balancing the budget, but putting in place pro-growth tax reform, a tax policy that actually incentivizes growth in the economy, not punishes people for their dreams and for their endeavor and for their labor. Energy policy that gets us energy independent. 10 years ago, nobody would have dreamed that was even possible. Right now, it's within our grasp if we get the federal government out of the way and allow us to become energy independent, which not only helps from an economic standpoint, but certainly helps from a national security standpoint. Regulation nation. We have regulatory oppression right now in this country from on high. The federal government dictating to you and every other American who wants to create an endeavor how to do that. what to do, when to do, how much to do, how little to do. It's just incredibly stifling to the economy. The cost of regulation in this country is estimated to be $1.8 trillion a year. A year. More than the individual tax income that is brought into the federal government. And then finally, health care, something that's near and dear to my heart. Health care spending is increasing at a rate greater than anything else in our federal economy. If we don't get Medicare, Medicaid, and Obamacare gone, Medicare, Medicaid spending under control, save and strengthen and secure those programs, then we will not get our spending under control and be able to have a pro-growth economy. So thanks for your commitment. Thanks for what you're doing. Thanks for your support of our efforts. I look forward to the other panelists and their comments, and also especially look forward to your questions and your concerns. God bless you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Price. You kept your remarks to about 7 minutes, and I forgot to mention that we'll ask the panelists to keep their remarks to 7 minutes, just so we'll have more time for your conversation and your questions. Our next speaker is Mark Green. Dr. Mark Green is an emergency medicine physician, another doctor, currently serving as a state senator for District 22 in Clarksville, Tennessee. In addition to that, Dr. Green was assigned to the 160th Special Operations Aviation Regiment. These are the same guys who you saw in the movie Lone Survivor. His most memorable mission was the capture of Saddam Hussein and his nearly 6-hour interview with the Iraqi dictator on the night of his capture. How about that? Mm-hmm. Dr. Green's military awards include the Bronze Star, the Combat Medical Badge, and the U.S. Army Ranger Tab, among others. Dr. Green has a bachelor's in economics from West Point and his medical degree from Wright State University in Dayton. Please put your hands together for Saddam Hussein's least favorite doctor, Mark Green.
Well, it's great to be here, and it's great to see you guys here engaged in this process. Politics is a team sport. It takes everybody going out there, making the right voice heard, and your participation today is very encouraging to me. It's thank you for that introduction, Deroy, and it's great to be on a panel with these guys. Dr. Price and I were actually on a panel back a few years ago at the Southern Republican Leadership Conference, and we were talking Obamacare at the time, but it's good to see you again, sir. You know, I spent about 20 years in the Army, and first as an infantryman and as a ranger, also as a special operations flight surgeon and physician. And what I learned was that the Army is like this big animal. It has a pulse, it breathes, it has its own life, and because of that, it's somewhat unpredictable. With one leader, it can go one way, and with one leader, it can go another way. And there's an excellent quote from the War of 1812 that kind of makes that point real clear. As the British general is burning Washington, D.C., an American yells to him and says, "Hey, if George Washington were still alive, you wouldn't have gotten here so easily." To that, the British admiral replied, "If George Washington were still president, we wouldn't have thought of coming here." The point is that leadership shapes behavior, and I've now been a CEO of a healthcare company for some years, and I've realized that the economy is very much like the Army. It's this big animal. It breathes and it moves, and it can go one way with one leader and another way with another leader. Let's look at the Reagan years. We had huge deficits, but we had massive economic growth, great economic growth. Look at what we have today. I mean, even during the Reagan years, the quote from Cheney was, "Reagan has proven that deficits don't matter." Remember that quote? But look at today. We've got massive debt, massive deficits, and our economic growth rate is the worst in 60 years. It matters who governs. It matters who's leading, just like in the Army. But our task today is really to talk about deficits and whether or not those deficits are caused by revenue or by spending. That's the question before us today. And again, we can look back at the Reagan era. We implemented the Art-Laffer curve and tax rates were reduced. Revenues shot through the roof. Massive revenues, great economic growth. But again, as I said earlier, We had huge deficits. The deficits, though, were a result of programmed spending increases. Remember at the end of the 70s and the beginning of the 80s, we had massive inflation. So just to break even, the federal government programmed 8 to 10% per year increases in spending. And when the inflation was wiped out, they didn't stop those spending increases. So from 81 to 89, we saw a 69% increase in federal outlays. So despite all this great revenue from the implementation of supply-side economics, we got massive debt. We got massive deficits. Look at the latter years of the Clinton presidency. Interesting, in Bush 41, we got a 3% increase in the marginal tax rate, and then again under Clinton, we got an 8% increase in the marginal tax rate, top marginal tax rate, but we saw capital gains rates drop 8% as well. Supply-siders suggest that the latter years of the Reagan administration, the tax burden then, and the tax burden under the latter years of the Clinton administration was about a wash. The difference was massive decreases in spending. Under Clinton, actually under the Reagan, or the Newt Gingrich and crew, we didn't have the S&L crisis, that was off the books. We won the Cold War, so defense spending came down. Those programmed increases from the 70s and 80s were done away with, and our per GDP spending plummeted. And what happened? We had a huge budget surplus. So under two different administrations, we got massive growth, we got deficits going in opposite directions, and the one difference was a focus on spending. It isn't about how much revenue you generate. It is about how much the government spends. In Tennessee, I'm a state senator there, and we balance our budget every year. Wouldn't it be great if the federal government could do something like that? And guess what? Tennessee has the lowest per capita debt in the country of any state. The lowest per capita debt of any country or any state in the nation. And our job creation is the fourth highest in the country. Again, we need Washington to understand that debt and economic growth are inversely proportional. And when they get that, and we stop spending, stop growing the federal debt, we'll get economic growth. It is about who's in charge. We've done a great job taking back over the Senate. We now own the House. Let's get the presidency in 2016 and get this done. Thanks. I look forward to being on the panel.
Thank you very much, Dr. Green. If anybody needs a seat, there are two up front here if anybody needs to sit down. 2 seats up here up front. Well, our next speaker and last speaker is Jonathan Bydlak. He is the president of the Coalition to Reduce Spending, the only national organization dedicated exclusively to reducing federal expenditures, and I'm very proud and happy to serve on its board of advisors. Jonathan began his career in the financial services industry as an investment analyst for one of the world's largest hedge funds. Excuse me. Jonathan was fundraising director for Ron Paul's 2008 presidential campaign. At the tender age of just 24, he managed a fundraising operation that gathered more than $35 million, chiefly online and through social media. Jonathan holds a bachelor's degree in economics from Princeton University. Please welcome the Grover Norquist of spending, Jonathan Bydlak.
I'll admit I was a little intimidated to be on this panel as I'm the only non-doctor on the panel, but as I told Deroy last night, I booked a room at a Holiday Inn Express, so at least I had that over them. So I've been thinking a lot about what I wanted to address you all regarding today, and the topic that I settled on is why does no one care about spending? And obviously that's a little bit of an exaggeration and perhaps strange to be coming from me who leads a group that is dedicated to the spending issue. You know, some people do care. I think all of you in this room clearly care about spending. But I think that there are also, the broader public really doesn't understand the importance of the spending issue, despite the fact that it's clearly what I would call the issue of our generation, the issue of our time. We talk about all sorts of policy all the time, whether it's foreign policy or healthcare or immigration policy, and the sort of massive spending that is behind any of these given areas is sort of always kind of treated like an afterthought. You rarely hear people say, well, how much is this going to cost? People don't like to ask that question. And the reality is that unfortunately in DC today, $1 billion here or $1 billion there is sort of just treated as a drop in the bucket and secondary to these other discussions that are going on. And my contention is that it doesn't need to be that way, and I think we would all agree that it shouldn't be that way. And so, as I said, to me, this is the issue of our time, and it's not an issue to just, people like to talk about spending as creating this debt that's a problem down the road for our kids and grandkids. But the reality is that it's a problem for everyone in this room, too, for the reasons that Dr. Price already alluded to. And, in my lifetime, I'm 30-something years, or 31, I guess, if we're being precise, more years than I'd like to admit. There's always been, I think, despite all of whichever party's been in power or who's been in power, there's been one thing that's always remained steady, or I guess if I'm speaking accurately, it's one thing that's steadily grown, and that's the level of spending, regardless of which party's been in power. And yet the thing that we know is that spending is already high, it's increasing, and the path that we're on is likely unsustainable. As of 2014, last year, so just to give a couple of statistics, spending at all levels of government in the United States, so federal, state, and local, is about 40% of GDP, so 40% of everything that we produce. That's the highest level since World War II. And if you want to compare it to something, tax revenue right now is at about 24% of GDP, so we're spending dramatically more than we're bringing in. And if you look at those numbers compared to sort of where they've been historically, what you find is that spending and taxation are both at all-time highs, and yet we're still running these deficits, we're still adding to the national debt. So what that tells me is that the problem that we have is a spending problem. It's not a revenue problem. It's spending first and foremost. And so then the question becomes, well, where is that spending taking place? And this is something that Dr. Price alluded to. The reality is that you just look at the federal budget, 65% of that spending, almost 2/3, is in so-called mandatory spending. It's entitlement programs, Social Security, Medicare, and Medicaid. And you contrast that with discretionary spending, which we've managed to keep in check reasonably well, which is only about 29% of the budget. And the trend for the last 50 years has been that entitlement spending has been increasing dramatically and consistently. And pretty much any forecast that you're going to find is going to tell you that entitlement spending is projected to continue to increase dramatically. And that's due to a lot of things, right? Whether it's the baby boomers retiring and sort of demographic changes, it's also due to new entitlements that we've added, like the current president's Affordable Care Act, or frankly George W. Bush's prescription drug benefit. And so, one of the recent estimates that I saw showed that of the increases that we expect to happen in spending over the next decade, 85% of those increases are due to only two things. It's entitlement spending and it's increases in interest on the debt. And so, back to my original question, how do we stop this trend if no one, and I think in particular one of the areas that Deroy asked me to speak on, young people, if no one really cares about it, if young people don't care about it. And the reality is that this is not an easy problem to solve. This is getting people to care about dollars and cents isn't as sexy as some other issues might be. And entitlement spending in particular, I think, is treated as this sort of third rail of politics that we can't really talk about. My argument, my contention to you is that if we're going to change the status quo, it's going to require two things. It's going to require better knowledge, and it's going to require better incentives. Voters have to know which of our elected officials are good on this issue, and they have to hold them accountable for the votes and the actions that they're taking. The reality is that the average person does not think in terms of dynamic CBO scores or projections of GDP. And so it's pretty much easy in that kind of environment for anyone to stand up and say that they're good on spending, that they're fiscally conservative. And so I think that for our issue to resonate, particularly with the younger generation, I guess I'm a bearer of bad news, like we have to be doing a better job than we've been doing. And that was sort of my motivation for starting the Coalition to Reduce Spending back in 2012. I think that the spending issue has to be branded in a way that has appeal and in a way that isn't strictly partisan. I like to say that if you remember the SOPA and PIPA debates from a couple of years ago, where there was sort of a bubbling up of support from across the political spectrum. And the reality is that spending is not a sort of right-wing or left-wing or conservative or libertarian issue. It's an American issue, and it's something that we all should be caring about and concerned about. And so anyway, I'll just kind of end by talking about what I think is the message that we need to be using when we're talking about spending. I think there's basically three sort of radical but also radically simple principles that we should be talking about. The first is this idea that all budgets should lead to balance. You know, we see these proposals coming from the president where you can project it out for 40 years and you don't even see any balancing at any point during that time. And, you know, there was a time, of course, when it was expected that budgets would balance. And now we've sort of put that on the back burner. You know, and if you say that, well, this budget balances in 10 years, that's treated as, oh, that's just those right-wingers taking this extreme position that, you know, revenue should equal what we're spending. The second principle that I think is really important is the notion that all spending should be open for reduction. You know, too often in DC right now, we have these sort of sacred cows that we're not willing to touch. And the reality is that if we're not willing to put everything on the table, you're not going to end up with any reductions at all. And you know, I think we know what those sacred cows are. On the left, it's entitlement spending. And on the right, frankly, it's the Pentagon, which makes up a substantial portion of our discretionary spending. And we can have that debate about how much we should cut from each portion later. But we should agree first and foremost that we have to be putting those topics on the table. And the last principle, as I see it, and I think perhaps the most important, is that fiscal responsibility is a game of trade-offs. You know, too often right now we have elected officials who basically act like Santa Claus. You know, you want a program for your constituents? Oh, sure, because I know that then you're going to vote for this other program that's going to benefit me, rather than sort of coming together and agreeing that we need to cut spending. And so cutting spending and fiscal responsibility requires thinking like economists, not pretending we're Santa Claus. And that, I think, is the very minimum standard that we should be demanding of all of our elected officials. And that once we start to create that accountability for these sorts of principles, that's when you're going to start to see the real fiscal responsibility that we need. So, thank you very much.
SOPA and PIPA, I believe those are two members of the British royal family, correct? I think I'll engage these gentlemen for about 13, 14 minutes or so, and then we'll throw things open to your questions. Let's start with Dr. Price, who was up until about 10:30 last night on the floor of the U.S. House of Representatives. I remember in November we won.
I hope you weren't watching.
I didn't watch the sausage being made or not made, as the case may be. But we won the biggest House Republican majority, I believe, since the 1920s. One of the strongest Senate Republican majorities. I'm not sure in how many years, but quite some years. And so I think we all thought things would be going nicely and smoothly by now, and that doesn't quite seem to be the case. So could you just give us some idea of how we've gotten into such a train wreck on the DHS budget amnesty situation?
Phew. Thanks, Deroy.
You're most welcome for that question.
Well, I think the fundamental problem is, and I mean this sincerely, our founders, I don't believe, ever envisioned an executive branch that would be lawless and aconstitutional or extra-constitutional. And so the construct of our government and the ability to be able to hold the executive in check with the numbers that we have gets extremely difficult. And so we as a group try to fashion a strategy to move forward that allows us to keep the administration in check, and that's what resulted in the plan in December. You remember we had 247 after the last election, the largest Republican majority in the House since 1928, and so you've got 247 ideas, or maybe more, about how to solve the problem. But it was decided that the funding for the federal government through the end of the fiscal year at September 30 would be done, except for the Department of Homeland Security. That was kept out because that was the portion that, by and large, funded the immigration issue, and the president's extra constitutional immigration issue. We felt it was best to defund that by holding the Department of Homeland Security funding out for a shorter period of time, the end of this month, the end of February. So yesterday that all came due. It's important to appreciate that the House passed complete funding of the Department of Homeland Security 6 weeks ago that had strings attached that said that the president can't use any of that money to implement his extra legal legalization of folks who are here illegally. Too many illegals. And the Senate was unable to get that to happen. That getting to the floor of the Senate required 60 votes. The Republicans in the Senate were unable to do so. The Democrats threatened to filibuster. I think the solution at that time would have been for Senator McConnell and the Senate Republicans to say, okay, if you're going to filibuster, let's go. And open the mics and be there 24/7 and let the Americans see this spectacle of people who want to defend this extra constitutional activity on the part of the president. That didn't happen, and so they threw back in our laps a complete funding of the Department of Homeland Security through the end of this fiscal year. We objected. The plan yesterday was to pass a 3-week spending for Department of Homeland Security. That failed on the floor of the House, and so we passed a 1-week funding for the Department of Homeland Security, hoping that we will find some grand strategy and plan in the meantime. So stay tuned. It was not pretty yesterday, but again, the challenge that we have, and it's a huge challenge. We are in the midst of a constitutional crisis in this country, because we have an executive branch that is extra-constitutional and lawless in so many of its actions. And it's going to take all branches to get him under control. Thank goodness that the court, Fifth Circuit in Texas, said that he couldn't do what he is trying to do in the area of illegal immigration. But whether or not that's held up through the Circuit Court and through the Supreme Court, we'll have to wait and see.
I would echo what Dr. Price says, and I tell people that it doesn't look or feel like it, but we're living in a dictatorship. The President of the United States does what the President of the United States wants to do. And if you don't like it, sue him. That's basically where we are today. And it's a horrifying situation. We don't have the guard dogs and the barbed wire, but we basically have somebody in the White House who does whatever he wants. And I think that's horrifying. Now, I want to ask Dr. Price this question as well. A friend of mine named Jonathan Rothenberg is a financier in Manhattan. He writes occasional letters to the editor of the Wall Street Journal, and he always has excellent ideas. And his thought on how we should handle this was that rather than attach the amnesty overturn provision in the DHS budget, why not pass the rest of the spending and then put that into, let's say, the budget of the EPA, or better yet, the budget of the IRS.
Yes.
So the debate would have been, okay, Democrats, do you want to shut down the EPA, or hey, let's all shut down the IRS?
Yeah.
And if that happened, most people wouldn't care about shutting down the EPA, and people would cheer if the IRS were closed.
Yeah.
Now, number one, is that possible? And number two, if we are going to attach measures to defund certain things, wouldn't it make sense to attach them to things the left cares about and the American people either don't care about or to which they're hostile, like the budgets of the EPA, the IRS, the National Labor Relations Board, bodies of the American government like that?
Deroy, I'm going to shock you, potentially, and say that was exactly the discussion that we were having in December. What to attach it to, and many of us believed that there was a better hostage to attach it to, and we didn't prevail.
Wow, how about that? Amazing, absolutely incredible. Let's see, State Senator Mark Green, I'm wondering if you can give us any examples among your colleagues with other state legislatures of things that they have done that have helped them to reduce spending, get government under control, and do the kinds of things that folks like us believe. Any lessons or examples from around the country when you talk to your colleagues?
Sure, absolutely. I mean, we have a budget process in Tennessee. When you have to balance the budget, you have to sit down and look at what gets cut. So our governor goes to every piece of the government and says, okay, I need a 2%, a 5%, and a 7% cut in your spending as you present your budget. I want 3 budgets. And so they come to the governor and they present a 2, a 5, and a 7, or whatever it is that year. Imagine if the federal government just across the board said 1%. We're going to cut spending 1%. I was in the military, as I said, and at the end of the fiscal year, and I'm confident that it's not just the military that spends money this way. I'm confident that it's lots of departments in the federal government. At the end of the fiscal year, someone came to us and said, hey, we haven't spent X. Want a new thermos? I'm not kidding. That has got to stop. And the only way for it to stop is to say, okay, let's make our budget and our revenue numbers match. And when they match, it requires leaders to go say, okay, we're going to chop 2% or 4% or whatever it is, just like I run a healthcare company, I'm in 5 states. I've gone to my guys and said, look, we have got to decrease costs in Georgia, all right? You do your cost accounting, the government has got to figure out how to do that. If we don't, we'll continue to spiral the plane into the ground. So I mean,
Very
it
vivid
really
image.
just comes down to making the decision to cut spending.
Terrific. Jonathan, we chatted a little bit last night at the National Review reception about the fact that a lot of people like to talk about the debt as something that is really the problem of the children and the grandchildren. And you pointed out to some of the drawbacks of using that kind of rhetoric. I'm wondering if you can expand on that a little bit and,
Yeah, I
and
think a
explain
lot-
to us why that might not be a very smart way to look at this.
Yeah, I think a lot of people like to talk about this in terms of generational warfare, you know, pitting the older generation against the younger generation. But the reality, as I said, is that, you know, we're having economic troubles today. And, you know, there's, I think, an opportunity. You know, I don't usually like to quote Rahm Emanuel, but of course you remember his quote where he talked about how there is an opportunity when times of difficulty. And I think that, you know, back in 2006, 2007, if you had said, you know, well, we need to reduce federal expenditures, most people would have said, oh, it's not really that big of a problem. The economy's humming along. We don't really have any sort of issues to worry about. But now you fast forward past the financial crisis and the sort of continued, you know, stagnant growth, and people are sort of asking questions. You know, why are we having the problems that we're having? And you know, so then it really comes down to, well, what information do people have? And, you know, if the only information they have is what, you know, certain editorial columnists are writing in the pages of the New York Times, then they're going to get one perspective on what the cause is of these economic issues. But if our side, I think, is able to present a more cohesive argument that highlights the fact that this is a problem today, not just a problem down the road, then perhaps we're able to sway more independents toward our way of thinking. But we have to provide that perspective. And I think that just talking in terms of, you know, the debt and it being a problem down the road lessens our ability to do so.
I'd recommend you take a look at the work of an economist, a fine supply-side economist by the name of David Malpass, M-A-L-P-A-S-S. And he's put out in great detail how the federal government, by borrowing so much money, essentially is crowding out private capital. So essentially, you go to the bank and ask for a loan for your new business or whatever, and your banker says, oh, I'd love to help you, but Uncle Sam was just here and he just cleaned out the vault, so good luck. And a lot of people, entrepreneurs, people looking to buy homes, et cetera, having trouble getting capital because Uncle Sam is in there vacuuming out this money in order to service this massive national debt. So I think Jonathan's right. This is not a problem just for the kids and the grandkids down the road. It's a problem for American adults today, unfortunately. One last question. I'll ask each of you to comment on this, and we'll throw things open to the audience. Ask you to look 5 or 10 years down the road if we don't do the kinds of things we're talking about in this room today, and we continue on this pace of spending and borrowing and debt that we have today. Is a Greek-style economic crisis beyond imagination? And related to that, what would happen if all of this deficit spending and national debt caused the dollar no longer to be the international reserve currency? What could be the results of that, and how might that look? Let's start with Dr. Price, move down the line.
Well, thanks, Deroy. This is the most predictable fiscal crisis that any nation has ever had. I mean, this is no surprise to anybody. All you have to do is look at the numbers, and the crowding out that you mentioned is absolutely correct. The mandatory spending that we had that Jonathan mentioned is about 2/3 of the federal budget. That means Medicare, Medicaid, Social Security, and interest on the debt comprise about 2/3 of the federal budget. In a few short years, it will be 100% of the federal budget, which means you could do away with the entire federal budget, other than Medicare, Medicaid, and Social Security. That means everything. That means defense, roads, education, energy, legislative branch, everything, commerce, the whole kit and caboodle, and you wouldn't even balance the budget. So anybody that tells you that we don't have to, as a society, address saving and strengthening and securing Medicare and Medicaid and Social Security is simply not telling you the truth. And what we need in this debate, I would suggest, is honesty. So, and we're in where it's not just generations down the road. It's right here. The Social Security Disability Program. The Social Security Disability Program goes broke next year. Not in 2024, not in 2030, not in 2033, like some of the other programs. Next year. What's the president's solution? Steal from the Social Security program. That's his solution. It's in his budget. That's the kind of solution that gets you where we are right now, which is not, if you're not going to solve the problem, then we're going to approach that fiscal crisis. What's a fiscal crisis looks like? It means in those programs, Medicare, Medicaid, and Social Security, that we as a society can't provide the services and the benefits that we have promised to the American people. And it means that the ability for us to borrow money to keep the government running ends. And when that happens, we spiral down pretty doggone quickly, and inflation takes hold. And if we as policymakers don't get it under control, the markets will get it under control. The numbers have to add up at some point. And then you get the kind of fiscal challenges it's an equal opportunity offender. Nobody escapes a fiscal crisis and hyperinflation, which is wholly possible. And this isn't, again, just a long-term problem. This is a very, very short-term problem. The good news is that there are ways to get out of this, and are ways to put us on a path to not just balance, but to paying off the debt. And we just call on our colleagues on the other side of the aisle to recognize the seriousness of the challenge and to join us in solving that challenge.
The clock, unfortunately, is working against us, so let's keep it to 30 seconds each on that question.
You can't inflate yourself out of this problem. We can't print enough money to fix it. If we don't cut the entitlement spending, we're done. We will crash the system, period. And it's funny, everybody wants spending cut until it's their trough that's being filled up. We have got to get control and make these bodies in D.C. balance the budget. It's got to be constitutional.
And Jonathan?
Yeah, I try to stay out of the prediction business, and if I were good at that, I'd still be in the hedge fund industry, I think. But I will say that I think, whether or not there's some, Greece-style collapse here is anyone's guess. But I think that one of the things that people often forget is that perhaps what could be even worse is sort of just a slow managed decline. It's sort of it's like the frog in the hot water. In some sense, if something calamitous happened overnight, that might actually go and wake us up and make us think about, more concretely the policies that have led to this problem. But what I worry more about, what keeps me up at night more, is this idea that it will just kind of keep going, declining, and we'll continue on this path, and that won't provide enough of an incentive for us to do something about it immediately.
Mm-hmm. As a non-doctor, it suggests perhaps it might be something like not suffering a devastating heart attack, but something more like congestive heart failure. Slow decline, very sad. Well, I think we've got about 15 minutes for questions, so why don't you stand up and tell us who you are and ask your question. Start with the gentleman right here.
I'm Jason Russell with the Washington Examiner. Dr. Price, could you talk about which options are on the table as you look to fix SSDI?
Which options are on the table to fix SSDI? That's the Social Security Disability Trust Fund. And as I mentioned, it's going broke next year. There are a lot of individuals who have examined the program who believe and have been able, I believe, to demonstrate that the amount of abuse of the disability program is significant. We believe, and we're running the numbers as we speak, and so I can't give you a quantifier on how much is available, but we believe if you institute true program integrity for the disability program, there are folks who indeed we as a society want to assist who have real disabilities and real challenges. But there are many others who are milking the system and are not being honest with us, with their fellow Americans, and are taking advantage of a system that has been very, very generous. So program integrity is where we're looking. The waste, fraud, and abuse that occurs in any federal program, we believe is the first place to start.
Over here. Oh, go ahead.
Could I just,
briefly? Yep.
very briefly, we ran 3% disability for most of the history of the program, and suddenly in the past few years it shot up to 6%. Americans didn't suddenly get more disabled. The program's implementation is the problem.
Very good. Let's get a question on this side. Gentleman right here.
Yes, Lawrence Willsdorf. This is a question for anybody who's really willing to answer. At this point, our generation, particularly like the millennials, it's almost laughable to think that we might actually have Social Security in the future for us, like when we're old. We're still paying into the system. We still understand that it's something that we promised older Americans who would get that. But really, do you really see it as something that's feasible for somebody like me, who's 24, went through college, is currently working in D.C., to actually even imagine
I'll just say, I mean, certainly not based on the trajectory that we're currently on. You know, I mean, I think as Americans, we have to have a debate about what Social Security should look like, and obviously there are perspectives from all across, you know, the spectrum on that. But the answer is, I think we all know, is that no, we're not going to be able to go and get more than what we're paying in based on the trajectory that we have right now.
Okay.
This is a great question, though. It's about Social Security and whether or not young people ought to be able to rely on Social Security being there for them. And I believe the answer is yes, if we make the program viable. Right now, the program's not viable. It's current workers paying for current retirees, and the numbers just don't add up. So and there are all sorts of folks in this room who understand how to fix this program so that it is there for individuals who are young, when they get old, able to realize a benefit that they have contributed to over their lifetime.
Okay, let's take this gentleman here.
Congressman, why, with the bill from last night, week extension, why can't the Senate, the same way they did with Obamacare, use reconciliation with the 51 votes and just sign off on the House bill?
The question is a little bit in the weeds, but it's why can't the Senate use reconciliation, which was a technique that the Senate Democrats used to refine Obamacare. It's not how they passed Obamacare, but it was the sidecar that was there with Obamacare. Reconciliation is a special process that allows the Senate to pass something with just 51 votes, doesn't take 60 votes. And the reason that it can't be done is because there's no reconciliation bill there, because this is a new Congress. You know, reconciliation doesn't exist until you pass a budget and it has reconciliation directives or instructions to the committees. So the vehicle isn't there to be able to do it.
Okay, on this side, gentleman in the white suit.
My question is about baseline budgeting, because it's not talked about when we talk about this. So is baseline budgeting a big driver in this? And if so, how do we get the word out so folks understand what that driver is, and how do we change the process of baseline budgeting, zero-based budgeting?
That's really, well, you want to go ahead and then I'll.
Baseline is what you measure off of. What amount of spending are you measuring off of to determine whether you're spending more or less, and how you're getting to balance. And right now, the baseline that we use is basically current law or current policy, which means it continues to go up and up and up and up and up. Zero-based budgeting is a baseline that is here, and so you've got to justify how much you're going to spend in every department, certainly at the state levels that use it. So the baseline is incredibly important, and it's a huge portion of the cost drivers in our country, which is why I believe that it's important to do a complete wholesale rewrite of the '74 Budget Act to get us having the rules that are in place to allow us to get control of the kind of spending that we have in Washington.
Excellent. Okay, let's see, back on this side, sir.
Yeah, Terry Walker from Florida. I heard one of your colleagues on the main stage this morning point at Harry Reid as a boogeyman on what's going on by the, but my question is, you control by the Constitution the process of initiating. Why can't you simply not do an education budget? You're going to regular order, sure. Why, just don't have an education budget, then there's no problem.
The question is, why can't we in Congress just not do an education budget and then there's no problem? I presume that you want to do away with the Department of Education, which is, yes, exactly.
And some others.
We'll start with that one.
It's a good start.
The answer to that question, and I mean, there are huge reforms that need to be made in the Department of Education, and I have been a supporter of making certain that we devolve all of it to the state level. And we've embraced federalism in our budget to be able to push as many things back to the state level, not just because it makes sense financially, but it provides for greater flexibility and greater choices for the American people in all these things if you get them back to the states. The quick answer on why it can't be done is because it takes 218 votes, and we don't have 218 votes in the Republican conference to not fund the Department of Education. There just aren't there.
How about that? How about that? All right, back on this side. Gentlemen, oops,
Need
right there.
218 votes to do that.
Social Security a segregated fund again? I know it's embedded in the general fund by Lyndon Johnson. Why can't we make an effort to try and segregate it so it's not constantly being talked about?
Everyone hear the question? You want to repeat the question?
Why, you want to take this, Jonathan? Why can't we segregate Social Security so that your Social Security money goes into a trust fund, which is the way it was designed. Johnson stopped that and threw it all into the general fund. And just a few years ago, we are now spending more than is coming in Social Security. So we're on a downward spiral, even including the money that we've promised to ourselves internally. And the reason that we could. It takes the political will and desire and heft to be able to make that happen, which is where you all come in. I talked about the importance of honest numbers before, and honesty in these numbers is absolutely vital. But it also is the work that you all do, and I know I'm preaching to the choir, to make certain that your legislators are responding to the priorities that you believe are most important, and spending priorities are absolutely vital. And the way we get these mandatory programs under control is to have individuals in Congress, in the House and the Senate, who will stand up and make that a priority to get them under control. And right now, we're lacking some numbers.
And I think, if I could add one thing to that, I think that it also comes down to the rules. That you're pointing, the question you're asking is sort of highlighting that it's not just reliant on having, the right people to go and do the right things at the right times, but you also need to have rules in place that ensure that money is spent in the way that we want it to be spent, regardless of who is in power. And so when you allow a system, right, where money can be, borrowed from here and put into here and so on, then you end up with these outcomes that are not the outcomes that we desire, regardless of whether Republicans or Democrats are in power. And so rules really matter.
All righty. On this side, I believe, sir.
Hi, Carl Gollivan. My question is whether or not spending reform really isn't a monetary reform issue. Because if we substituted for the word money here, irredeemable IOUs borrowed into existence at usury, it would all sound kind of silly. And there's a gentleman who came out of Tennessee, Frederick Tupper Saucy, a constitutional monetary activist, who thought that at the state and circuit level, we just reminded all of our local officials they've taken an oath that to protect the Constitution, which says no state shall make anything but gold and silver coin, the tender of payment of debt, that if they began to obey their oaths at the state and local level, it might rise up and Washington might become aware it needs to restore redeemability, even the circulating gold and silver coin, which might allow us to actually honor a new Bretton Woods agreement, which we, of course, abdicated long ago. Your perspective on whether monetary reform is really the solution to spending problems?
Well, I genuinely believe that from a monetary supply, right, if that's what you're talking, if your question is about our current monetary supply, the interest rates and the printing of money and QE2 have been a contributor to a part of the problem. There's no doubt about that. Raising rates now, strengthening the dollar, driving foreign investment into the United States, how that impacts the trade deficit and things like that, employment in the United States, those are all they're all on the table. It should all be on the table. We've got to discuss it all. Today's panel was about spending cuts and how that correlates to deficits, but you're absolutely right. Monetary policy is a part of the policy mix, and it's got to be a part of the discussion.
Let's take one last brief question with one last brief answer. Gentleman right there. Thanks.
Yes, I was going to ask Congressman if he supports the audit the Fed bill, and then also for the state of Tennessee, would you support a state bank?
Do I support the audit the Fed bill? Yes, I've been a co-sponsor and believe strongly that the Fed needs to be audited.
Excellent.
And I personally do not support a state bank.
Those are two excellent answers on which to close our panel. Please give our thanks to Dr. Tom Price, State Senator Mark Green, and Jonathan Bydlak. Thank you very much.